The dust had barely settled on Delilah Sullivan's second broken engagement when the preacher's wife suggested it might be best if she left Downeyville, California altogether. And that single conversation changed everything about who she thought she could become. Delilah stood in the Mercantile on that scorching afternoon in July of 1874, her hands trembling as she counted out coins for flour and coffee beans. The whispers had grown louder over the past 3 weeks, ever since Thomas Brennan had publicly called off their wedding just 2 days before the ceremony. It was not the embarrassment of being jilted that stung most deeply, but rather the cruel mathematics of her romantic failures. One broken engagement might be overlooked as simple misfortune. 2 suggested a pattern that polite society could forgive with enough time and charitable gossip. But when Thomas became the second man in 18 months to decide she was not worth marrying after all, the women of Downeyville had reached a collective verdict that felt as final as any judge's gavel. Mrs. Henderson, the mercantile owner's wife, had been kind enough in her delivery, speaking in low tones near the pickle barrel. But her message carried the weight of social decree. The church ladies had discussed the matter, she explained, and they worried that Delilah's continued presence might give the younger girls improper ideas about the seriousness of matrimonial commitments. It would be better, Mrs. Henderson suggested with practiced sympathy, if Delilah perhaps sought opportunities elsewhere. Perhaps with her aunt in Sacramento, or maybe even San Francisco, where such personal histories could be forgotten in the anonymity of city life. Delilah had nodded numbly, paid for her goods, and walked out into the bright mountain sunlight feeling as though the entire town was watching her retreat. She was 23 years old, and apparently her shelf life as a respectable woman had expired before she had even properly understood the rules of preservation. The first engagement had been to William Cassidy, a banker's son with soft hands and softer ambitions. They had courted for 5 months before he proposed on a mild spring evening, presenting her with his grandmother's ring and promises of a house on the hill. But 6 weeks later, his mother had paid Delilah a visit. Mrs. Cassidy had been direct, explaining that William's prospects required a wife who brought more substantial connections to the marriage. Delilah's family, while respectable enough, consisted of a deceased father who had been a mining surveyor and a mother who took in sewing to make ends meet. The ring had been returned, the engagement dissolved, and William had married a girl from Nevada City, whose father owned 3 stamp mills before the year was out. Thomas Brennan had seemed different. He was a railroad company surveyor, practical and straightforward, without the social pretensions that had doomed her first attempt at matrimony. He had courted her with genuine affection, or so she had believed, taking her on walks along the river and speaking earnestly about building a life together. When he proposed, Delilah had accepted with cautious hope, thinking perhaps her first failure had simply been a matter of poor matching. But Thomas had grown increasingly distant as the wedding approached, finding reasons to delay their meetings and offering thin excuses for his distraction. Finally, he had come to her mother's house and explained with obvious discomfort that he had realized his feelings were not sufficient for marriage. The truth, as Delilah later learned from a sympathetic neighbor, was that Thomas's colleagues had teased him mercilessly about taking on damaged goods, and he had lacked the backbone to withstand their mockery. Now Delilah walked home carrying her purchases and the knowledge that Downeyville no longer wanted her. Her mother would be devastated, but there was no fighting the social current once it had turned against you. She had perhaps 2 weeks before the pressure became unbearable, before even basic civility would be withdrawn, and her mother's sewing business would suffer from the association. She spent that evening sorting through her few possessions, trying to determine what she might take with her and where exactly she might go. Her aunt in Sacramento had written kindly enough over the years, but they were not close, and Delilah hated the idea of arriving as a charity case, a failed woman seeking refuge. San Francisco terrified her with its size and reputation. She had never been further than Nevada City in her entire life. The next morning, Delilah was hanging laundry in the small yard behind her mother's house when she heard a commotion from the street. Raised voices carried through the summer air, and she recognized the aggressive tone of Cal Peterson, a ranch hand known for his temper and his tendency to drink away his wages. She hurried through the side gate to see what was happening. Cal had cornered a cowboy she did not recognize, a tall man in dusty trail clothes who stood beside a paint horse loaded with supplies. The stranger held himself with remarkable calm despite Cal's aggressive posturing, his hands loose at his sides, his expression neutral. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the possibility of entertainment. "I am not looking for trouble," the stranger was saying, his voice level and unhurried. "I stopped to water my horse and ask about supplies. Nothing more." "You are looking at me like I am dirt," Cal snarled, swaying slightly. He had clearly started drinking early. "I know your type. Think you are better than honest working men." Delilah could see the situation spiraling toward violence. Cal was known to throw punches when he felt slighted, which was often, and the stranger, despite his calm demeanor, had the look of someone who could handle himself in a fight. The last thing Downeyville needed was more trouble, and something in Delilah rebelled against simply watching another person be subjected to unearned judgment. "Mr. Peterson," she called out, stepping forward before she could reconsider. "I believe your boss was looking for you earlier. Something about the fence line repairs that need finishing before Monday." Cal turned to glare at her, his face flushed. "This does not concern you, Miss Sullivan, though I suppose you are used to inserting yourself where you are not wanted." The comment landed like a slap, and Delilah felt her face burn. But she held her ground, meeting Cal's bleary gaze steadily. "Nevertheless, I am fairly certain Mr. Crawford will not appreciate having to search town for you. You know how particular he is about timely work." The mention of his employer seemed to penetrate Cal's alcoholic haze. He spat into the dust, cast one more hostile look at the stranger, and stalked off muttering under his breath. The small crowd, disappointed by the lack of violence, began to disperse. The stranger turned to Delilah, and she got her first clear look at him. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. His face was tanned from long hours in the sun, and he had the lean build of someone who lived in the saddle. When he touched the brim of his hat in thanks, she noticed his hands were scarred and calloused from hard work. "I appreciate the intervention, miss," he said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. "Though I am sorry you had to endure that man's rudeness on my account." "Cal Peterson is rude on everyone's account," Delilah replied, trying to sound light despite the way her heart was still racing. "You should not take it personally. Even so, that took courage." He extended his hand. "Graham Owens." She hesitated only briefly before taking it. "Delilah Sullivan." His handshake was firm but gentle, and he released her hand with proper courtesy. "Are you from Downeyville, Miss Sullivan, or just passing through?" "Born here," she said, then added with a touch of bitterness she had not intended to reveal. "Though I may be passing through before long, depending on how you define such things." Graham Owens studied her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow was not. "That sounds like a story, if you do not mind my saying so. One I doubt you want to hear. Are you here for the mining work? Passing through on my way to a ranch job near Truckee. Thought I would stop to rest my horse and resupply. He glanced toward the mercantile. Though given the reception, I am wondering if I should just keep riding. The town is not all like Cal Peterson, Delilah said, feeling an unexpected need to defend her home despite its current rejection of her. Most people here are decent enough. And yet you are leaving. The question was gentle, genuinely curious rather than prying. Delilah found herself wanting to answer honestly, perhaps because this stranger would be gone by tomorrow, and her words could not follow her beyond this moment. Let us just say that I have made social mistakes that the town has decided are unforgivable. It has been suggested that my departure would be preferable to my continued presence. Graham's expression darkened slightly. Social mistakes. That is a broad term that usually means someone dared to be human in ways that made others uncomfortable. I was engaged twice. Both engagements ended badly. Apparently that makes me a corrupting influence on the young women of Downieville. She was surprised by how much anger leaked through her careful control. I am 23 years old, and I have somehow managed to destroy my reputation without even doing anything truly scandalous. I never behaved improperly. I simply had the misfortune to be chosen, and then unchosen by two men who decided I was not worth keeping their promises for. The words hung in the air between them, more raw and honest than Delilah had intended. She felt her face flush with embarrassment at having revealed so much to a complete stranger. But when she looked at Graham Owens, she saw no judgment in his expression, only thoughtful consideration. "So they are casting you out for other people's failures," he said quietly. "That seems to be how these things usually work. The person with the least power takes the most blame. That is one way of looking at it, I suppose." Graham was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the mountains that ringed the valley. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was working through an idea as he articulated it. "I do not know you, Miss Sullivan, and you certainly do not know me. But I have learned in my years of drifting that sometimes the best decisions are the ones that seem the most improbable when you make them. I am not sure I follow your meaning, Mr. Owens." He looked back at her, and there was something both earnest and daring in his expression. "I am headed to a ranch in Truckee where I will be working as the head wrangler. The job comes with a small house on the property. The ranch owner mentioned in his letter that married men are preferred because they are more likely to stay put, but he was willing to hire me despite my single status because I came recommended by someone he trusts." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I realize this will sound like madness, but what if it did not have to be a lie? What if you left Downieville not as a rejected woman fleeing her mistakes, but as my wife, heading toward a new life and a new opportunity?" Delilah stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. "I beg your pardon. I am proposing marriage, Miss Sullivan. I realize we have known each other for all of 10 minutes, but consider the practical aspects. You need to leave this town and start fresh somewhere that does not know your history. I need to appear settled and reliable to keep a good job that I genuinely want. We could help each other. You cannot be serious." But even as she said it, Delilah felt a strange flutter in her chest, part terror and part something that might have been hope. "I am completely serious. Look, I know it sounds insane, but think about it practically. Your alternative is to throw yourself on the mercy of relatives who may or may not want you, to go to a city where you know no one, or to stay here and endure increasing cruelty until you are completely broken by it. My alternative is to take this job and constantly worry that my employer will find a married man he likes better and turn me out. This could solve both our problems. You do not know anything about me. I could be terrible. I could be lazy or cruel or impossible to live with. You intervened when a stranger was being harassed, even though it would have been easier and safer to keep walking. That tells me something about your character." Graham's expression softened. "And I watched how you stood there and took that man's insult without flinching." "You have spine, Miss Sullivan. I respect that." "This is insane," Delilah repeated, but her mind was already racing through the implications. People do not just marry strangers. People in the territories do it all the time. Mail-order brides, hasty marriages of convenience, arrangements made for practical reasons. At least we would be making the choice ourselves, with clear eyes about what it is. And what is it, exactly? Graham considered the question seriously. An agreement between two people who need something from each other. A partnership. I will not lie and promise you romance or grand passion. But I can promise you respect, and honest dealing, and my best effort to be a good husband. And who knows? A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. Maybe third time will be forever. The phrase struck something deep in Delilah's chest. Third time will be forever. It was both ridiculous and oddly compelling, the kind of statement that acknowledged her history without condemning her for it. "I need to think," she said, her voice unsteady. "Of course. I will be in town until tomorrow morning. If you decide you want to take this chance, meet me at the livery stable at dawn. If you do not come, I will understand and I will ride on with no hard feelings. But Delilah." He used her first name with a familiarity that should have been presumptuous, but somehow felt natural. Sometimes the craziest sounding option is actually the sanest choice you can make. He tipped his hat again and led his horse toward the livery stable, leaving Delilah standing in the street with her thoughts spinning like a dust devil. She walked home in a daze, barely aware of her surroundings. When she arrived, her mother was working on a dress commission at the kitchen table, her needle flashing in the afternoon light streaming through the window. "You were gone longer than expected," her mother said, glancing up. "Is everything well?" Delilah sank into a chair across from her mother, struggling to find words for what had just happened. Mary Sullivan was 51 years old and had been widowed for nearly a decade. She had worked herself nearly to exhaustion to keep them housed and fed after Delilah's father died in a mine accident. The lines around her eyes spoke of too many worries and too little sleep. Delilah hated the thought of adding to her burdens, but she also knew that her mother deserved the truth. "Something happened today, something completely unexpected." Delilah took a deep breath. "I was just proposed to by a man I met approximately 15 minutes before he asked." Her mother's needle stopped mid-stitch. "What?" Delilah explained the entire encounter, watching her mother's expression shift from confusion to concern to something that might have been cautious consideration. When she finished, Mary set down her sewing and rubbed her temples. "This is extraordinarily irregular, Delilah. I know. You know nothing about this man. He could be anyone. He could have any sort of history or intentions. I know that too. And yet you are considering it." It was not a question. Delilah met her mother's eyes. "The preacher's wife suggested I leave town yesterday. Mrs. Henderson made it clear that I am no longer welcome in polite society. Every day I stay here, it becomes harder for both of us. Your sewing business will suffer if people think you are supporting my moral corruption, or whatever they have decided my broken engagements represent. I do not care about my business if it means losing you to some stranger who might harm you. But what if he is telling the truth? What if this really is just a practical arrangement that could benefit both of us? Mother, what are my actual options here? Aunt Caroline in Sacramento has 6 children and barely enough space as it is. San Francisco terrifies me. Staying here means watching people turn their backs on you because of me. At least with Graham Owens, I would be going somewhere with purpose, as someone's wife rather than someone's charity case. Mary was quiet for a long time, her work-worn hands folded on the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I want you to be happy, sweetheart. I want you to be safe. I do not know if this cowboy can offer you either of those things." "I do not know either," Delilah admitted. "But I know that staying here will not offer them, and going anywhere else alone will not offer them. At least this way I would have a partner, an agreement. Something solid to stand on. You said he mentioned Truckee. That is not impossibly far. I could come visit, make sure you are being treated well. You would not try to stop me." Her mother's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You are 23 years old and more capable than you give yourself credit for. I raised you to think for yourself, to be strong. I cannot protect you from the world as much as I might want to. If you believe this is your best path forward, then I will support you. But please, please be careful. Trust your instincts. If anything feels wrong, if he proves to be other than he seems, you come straight home. Do you understand me?" Delilah nodded, her own eyes burning. She had not realized how much she needed her mother's permission, or at least her understanding. They talked late into the evening, discussing practicalities and possibilities, fears and faint hopes. By the time Delilah went to bed, she had made her decision. She barely slept, rising well before dawn to pack a small trunk with her possessions. She owned little of value: some clothes, her father's surveying compass, her mother's wedding quilt, a few books. Her mother was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and red eyes that suggested her own sleepless night. They did not speak much as Delilah dressed in her best traveling clothes, a practical wool skirt and jacket in deep blue that her mother had made 2 years ago. There were no words adequate for this moment, this strange goodbye that felt both too rushed and too painful to endure. "Write to me as soon as you arrive," her mother said at the door, gripping Delilah's hands tightly. "And remember what I said. If anything goes wrong, you come home. I love you, Mama. I love you too, sweet girl, more than you can possibly know." The walk to the livery stable felt surreal in the pre-dawn darkness, as though Delilah were moving through a dream. She half expected Graham Owens to not be there, to discover this had all been some elaborate misunderstanding or cruel joke. But as she approached, she saw him waiting beside his horse, a pack mule loaded with supplies standing beside it. He straightened when he saw her, and even in the dim light she could see relief cross his face. "You came," he said simply. "I came," she confirmed, setting down her small trunk. "Though I should tell you, I am still not entirely certain this is not insane." "I am fairly sure it is insane," Graham replied with a hint of a smile. "But sometimes insane is better than the alternative." He gestured to the pack mule. "I have space for your trunk here. The ride to Truckee will take us most of 3 days, maybe 4 depending on conditions. I thought we could be married by the preacher here before we leave, make it official and proper. At this hour, I spoke with Reverend Collins last evening. Explained the situation, or at least the parts that mattered. He agreed to marry us at first light, no questions asked. He is a practical man, and I think he understood that sometimes people need fresh starts." Delilah felt a rush of gratitude toward the Reverend, whom she had never particularly liked during Sunday services. "Then I suppose we should not keep him waiting." The ceremony was brief and businesslike, conducted in the small church with only the Reverend and his wife as witnesses. Delilah stood beside this man. She had known for less than a day and repeated vows that should have felt momentous, but instead felt oddly practical. Graham's voice was steady as he promised to honor and cherish her, and when he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, she noticed his hands were not quite steady. I pronounce you man and wife, Reverend Collins said, and just like that, Delilah Sullivan became Delilah Owens. You may kiss your bride, son. Graham looked at her questioningly, silently asking permission. Delilah nodded, and he leaned forward to press a chaste kiss to her lips. It was over in a moment, nothing romantic about it, but it made the whole thing feel suddenly, startlingly real. They signed the marriage certificate, and Reverend Collins handed them their copy with a kindly smile. May the Lord bless your union and grant you many years of happiness together. Outside, the sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky with streaks of gold and pink. Graham helped Delilah onto a gentle mare he had purchased the previous day, explaining that she would need her own horse for the journey and for life on the ranch. Then they rode out of Downieville as the town was waking up, leaving behind everything Delilah had ever known. The first day of travel was quiet, both of them wrapped in their own thoughts. Graham set a steady pace, stopping regularly to rest the horses and allow Delilah to stretch her legs. She was not an experienced rider, and by midday she could feel muscles protesting that she had not known existed. But she refused to complain, determined to prove she could handle whatever this new life required. They made camp that evening near a creek, and Graham proved efficient at setting up their temporary home. He built a small fire, made coffee, and prepared a simple meal of beans and bacon. Delilah watched him work, noting the easy competence of his movements, the way he seemed completely comfortable in the wilderness. You have done this many times before, she observed. Been on the trail, more times than I can count. I have been working ranches and cattle drives since I was 16 years old. My father was a cowhand, and my older brother still works a ranch down in Nevada. I learned early that if you want to eat and stay warm, you had better know how to take care of yourself. Do you have other family? My mother passed when I was young. My brother and I are not particularly close, though we are not hostile either. We just live different lives. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one. What about you? Just your mother? Just my mother now. My father died when I was 13. Mining accident. I am sorry. That is hard, losing a parent young. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping coffee and listening to the creek burble over its rocky bed. Delilah found herself studying her new husband in the firelight, trying to reconcile the reality of her situation. She was married, to a stranger, riding toward a future she could not begin to imagine. I should probably tell you more about myself, Graham said eventually. Since we are married now and all, I am 26 years old. I do not drink to excess, I do not gamble away my money, and I do not raise my hand to women or animals. I can read and write well enough, though I am not educated. I am good with horses and decent with cattle. I tend to be quiet, but that is temperament rather than sullenness. I save most of my wages and I honor my commitments. He paused. I suppose the most important thing you should know is that I meant what I said about respect and honest dealing. I will not lie to you, Delilah, and I will not mistreat you. That is a promise I intend to keep. Why were you still unmarried at 26? The question escaped before Delilah could consider whether it was appropriate. I mean, if you do not mind my asking. Graham smiled slightly. Fair question, given that I know your history. The truth is I never stayed in one place long enough to properly court anyone. I have been moving from ranch to ranch, taking jobs where I could find them, learning different aspects of the business. I wanted to feel like I knew what I was doing before I tried to settle down. The job in Truckee is the first real opportunity I have had for something permanent, something I could build a life around. And you needed a wife to secure it. I did. I do. But Delilah, I want you to know that even though this started as a practical arrangement, I plan to do right by you. I am not looking for a housekeeper or a business arrangement on paper only. I am hoping we can build something real here. Friendship, at least, maybe more if we are fortunate." The sincerity in his voice made Delilah's chest tighten. "I will do my best to be a good wife. I can cook and clean and sew. I can manage household accounts. I have never worked with livestock, but I am willing to learn. I am sure you will be fine. And Delilah, thank you for taking this chance. I know it took courage." That night, Graham set up 2 bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, giving Delilah privacy and space without making a point of it. She lay awake for a long time, watching the stars wheel overhead and wondering what her mother was doing, whether the town was already gossiping about her sudden departure. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she slept. The second day brought them higher into the mountains, following trails that wound through stands of towering pines and across meadows spangled with wildflowers. Graham pointed out landmarks and explained the route, treating Delilah like a partner in their journey rather than cargo to be transported. She found herself relaxing slightly, drawn in by his steady presence and the unexpected beauty of the landscape. "Have you been to Truckee before?" she asked as they rode side by side through a particularly lovely valley. "Once, about a year ago. It is a good town, smaller than Downieville but growing because of the railroad. The ranch is a few miles outside of town, about 300 acres with good grazing and access to water. The owner is a man named Robert Chandler. He made his money in freight hauling and bought the ranch 5 years ago as an investment. He is building up a breeding operation for horses, wants to develop a reputation for quality stock, and he trusts you to run his wrangling operation. He is trusting my reputation, which comes from a man named Jack Thornton who I worked for in Nevada. Jack knows good horseflesh and good horsemen, and he told Chandler I was worth hiring. I aim to prove him right. You care about this job, about doing well at it. I do. I am tired of drifting, Delilah. I want to put down roots, build something that lasts. This job is my opportunity to do that." They camped that night near a small lake that reflected the surrounding peaks like a mirror. Graham caught trout for their dinner, frying them in a pan over the fire until the skin was crispy and the flesh flaked apart at the touch of a fork. It was the best meal Delilah had eaten in days, and she told him so. "My brother taught me to fish when we were boys," Graham said, looking pleased by the compliment. "He said a man who could feed himself from the land would never go hungry. He was right about that, at least." "Tell me about the house we will be living in," Delilah said, curious about the details of her new home. "It is nothing fancy, but it is solid. 2 rooms, a main living area with a kitchen space and a separate bedroom. There is a well nearby and a small barn for keeping a few personal animals separate from the main ranch stock. Chandler said the previous wrangler had started a vegetable garden that had gone to seed, so there is space for that if you are interested in planting. I would like that. My mother always kept a garden. I helped her with it." They talked late into the evening, sharing stories from their pasts, learning the shape of each other's lives. Delilah found herself surprised by how easy Graham was to talk to, how he listened with genuine interest, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. When they finally settled into their respective bedrolls, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. It was not love, not yet, but it might have been the beginning of liking, which felt like more than she had dared hope for. The third day brought them within reach of Truckee, and they arrived in the late afternoon. The town was indeed smaller than Downieville, but it had a prosperous feel to it, with new buildings going up and the railroad tracks gleaming in the sunlight. Graham led them through the main street, and then out along a road that climbed into the hills beyond. The Chandler Ranch appeared as they crested a rise, spread out across a broad valley with mountains rising on all sides. Delilah could see several barns, a large main house, and numerous corrals where horses grazed peacefully. It was beautiful in a raw, powerful way that made her breath catch. "This is it," Graham said quietly. "Our new home." They rode down to the main house, where a man Delilah assumed was Robert Chandler emerged to greet them. He was perhaps 50 years old, barrel-chested and weathered, with sharp eyes that took in everything at once. "Owens," he said, extending a hand. "Good to see you made it. I was beginning to wonder if you had changed your mind about the job." "Not at all, sir. Just took a bit longer to settle some affairs." Graham gestured to Delilah. "Mr. Chandler, this is my wife, Delilah." "Delilah, this is Robert Chandler, the ranch owner." If Chandler was surprised by the sudden appearance of a wife, he hid it well. He tipped his hat to Delilah with Old West courtesy. "Mrs. Owens, it is a pleasure to have you here. I hope you will find the accommodations acceptable." "I am sure we will, Mr. Chandler. Thank you for the opportunity." Chandler showed them to the wrangler's house, which was exactly as Graham had described. It was small but well built, with a stone fireplace, glass windows, and a solid roof. The furniture was basic but serviceable. A table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace, a bed frame in the separate bedroom. It was Spartan but clean, and Delilah immediately began mentally arranging how she would make it into a proper home. "You will start work tomorrow, Owens," Chandler said. "I will show you around the operation, introduce you to the other hands. Mrs. Owens, if you need anything, my wife Ann is up at the main house. She will be happy to help you settle in." After Chandler left, Delilah and Graham stood in their new home, suddenly alone and married and faced with the reality of building a life together. Graham cleared his throat awkwardly. "I can sleep out in the barn for a while, if you would prefer. Give you some privacy while we adjust to all of this." Delilah considered the offer, appreciating the thoughtfulness behind it, but something in her rebelled against starting their marriage with distance and avoidance. "We are married, Graham, properly married. I think we should try to act like it, do you not? Within reason, of course, but sleeping in different buildings seems like a poor way to begin." "Within reason," Graham agreed, looking relieved. "The bed is big enough that we can share it respectfully, and Delilah, thank you for being willing to try." They spent the rest of the evening unpacking their few belongings and settling into the house. It was strange and awkward and occasionally uncomfortable, but it also felt oddly right, like they were building something together even in these small domestic tasks. When night fell, they lay in bed with careful space between them, both acutely aware of the other's presence. "Good night, Delilah," Graham said softly. "Good night, Graham." The next morning began Graham's work on the ranch, and Delilah met Ann Chandler, who proved to be a warm, practical woman in her mid-40s. She showed Delilah around the ranch, introduced her to the other wives who lived on the property, and provided supplies to help stock their small kitchen. "I am so pleased Graham found himself a wife," Ann said as they walked back toward the wrangler's house. Robert was concerned about hiring an unmarried man, worried he would be off chasing women in town instead of focusing on his work. "You have put his mind at ease." Delilah felt a pang of guilt at the deception, even though technically there was no lie. She was Graham's wife, legally and properly. The circumstances were simply unusual. "I am happy to be here, Mrs. Chandler." Graham spoke very highly of the opportunity. "Please call me Ann. We do not stand on too much formality here, and I hope you will feel welcome to call on me if you need anything. It can be lonely out here, especially if you are not accustomed to ranch life." Over the following days and weeks, Delilah settled into her new existence. She cleaned and organized the house, planted a garden with seeds Ann provided, and learned the rhythms of ranch life. Graham worked long hours with the horses, coming home tired but satisfied, always ready to share stories about his day. They fell into an easy domesticity, cooking meals together, talking by the fire in the evenings, gradually learning each other's habits and preferences. What surprised Delilah most was how much she enjoyed Graham's company. He was kind without being overbearing, funny in a dry, understated way, and genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. He taught her about horses, patiently explaining bloodlines and training techniques. She taught him about plants, showing him which wildflowers were edible and which should be avoided. They were building a friendship, and Delilah found herself looking forward to the end of each day when Graham would come home and they could be together. One evening, about 6 weeks after their arrival, they sat on the small porch of their house watching the sun set behind the mountains. Graham had his arms stretched along the back of the bench they sat on, not quite touching Delilah but close enough that she could feel his warmth. She had been thinking about something all day, trying to find the right words. "Graham, can I ask you something? Always. Do you ever regret it? Marrying me, I mean. Taking on a stranger based on a wild impulse." He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Not even once." "Do you regret it?" "No," Delilah said, and realized as she spoke that it was completely true. "I thought I would. I thought I would spend every day terrified or miserable or regretting my choice. But I do not. I like my life here. I like our home. I like you, Graham." His smile started slow and spread until it transformed his entire face. "I like you too, Delilah, more than I expected to, honestly. When I asked you to marry me, I was hoping for civility and basic partnership. What I got is so much better than that. We are friends, are we not?" "We are definitely friends." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, more vulnerable. "I have been thinking that maybe we could be more than that, if you were interested. No pressure, but I wanted you to know that my feelings have been changing, growing into something deeper." Delilah's heart was pounding. She had been feeling the same shift, the way her awareness of Graham had intensified over the past weeks. She noticed things now. The way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the gentleness of his hands when he worked with the horses, the sound of his voice when he spoke her name. She had started to long for his presence when he was away, to feel a warmth in her chest when he came through the door each evening. "I think I would be interested in that," she said quietly, "if we took it slowly. I am still learning how to trust this. Trust us. Slowly is fine." "We have all the time in the world." Graham shifted slightly, and his hand came to rest on her shoulder, warm and reassuring. "Third time will be forever, remember? I meant that." They sat together as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, not speaking but comfortable in the silence. When they finally went inside, Graham kissed her goodnight for the first time since their wedding day, a sweet, tentative kiss that promised more without demanding it. Delilah went to sleep feeling lighter than she had in months, maybe years. The summer turned to autumn, painting the mountainsides in gold and crimson. Graham excelled at his work, and Chandler made it clear he was pleased with his new head wrangler. Delilah had made friends with some of the other ranch wives and had proven herself capable in managing their household. Her garden had flourished, providing vegetables that she canned for the winter ahead. But more importantly, the relationship between Delilah and Graham had deepened into something neither of them had anticipated when they made their hasty agreement. They were genuinely falling in love, a slow, steady building of affection and desire and partnership. Graham courted her properly now, bringing her wildflowers he found on his rides, taking her on picnics by the river, stealing kisses that grew longer and more heated as the weeks passed. One evening in late October, with the first snow threatening in the heavy clouds overhead, Graham came home carrying a small box. Delilah was making stew for dinner, and she looked up curiously as he set the box on the table. "What is that?" "Open it and see." Inside was a beautiful hand-carved wooden box, and inside that was a delicate silver locket. Delilah gasped as she lifted it out, admiring the intricate engraving on its surface. "Graham, this is beautiful, but you should not have spent the money." "I wanted to. You deserve pretty things, Delilah. You deserve everything good." He took the locket from her hands and opened it, showing her the small space inside where photographs could be placed. "I thought maybe we could get our pictures made next time we go into town, start our own family history." Tears pricked Delilah's eyes. "I love it." "Thank you. There is something else I want to say." Graham took her hands in his expression earnest and a little nervous. "I know we got married for practical reasons. I know this whole thing started as an arrangement of convenience. But Delilah, somewhere along the way it became real for me." "You became real for me, more real than anything else in my life. I love you. Not because I need to, not because it makes sense, but because you are the best person I have ever known, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Delilah felt tears spill over, but they were happy tears, joyful tears. "I love you too, Graham, so much that it scares me sometimes. I never expected this. I never expected you." He kissed her then, deep and passionate, and when they finally broke apart they were both breathing hard. "Come to bed with me," he said softly. "Not because we are supposed to, but because we want to, because we choose each other." "Yes," Delilah whispered. "Yes, I choose you." That night, they made their marriage real in every sense, coming together with tenderness and passion and a deep sense of rightness. Afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Delilah felt a peace she had never known before. She had been cast out by her community, labeled as damaged and unworthy. But Graham had seen something different in her, something worth choosing. And in choosing each other, they had created something beautiful and true. The winter was hard, as winters in the high country always were. Snow piled high around their little house, and temperatures dropped to bone-chilling levels. But inside, Delilah and Graham built a warm sanctuary. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other, playing cards, talking about their dreams for the future. Graham taught Delilah to play the harmonica he kept from his cowboy days, and she taught him the songs her mother used to sing. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and revealing the green earth beneath, Delilah realized she had missed her monthly courses twice in a row. She said nothing at first, afraid to hope, but when another week passed with increasing nausea each morning, she could no longer deny the truth. She was pregnant. She told Graham one evening after dinner, simply and directly. "I think I am going to have a baby." He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then a huge grin split his face and he let out a whoop of joy, sweeping her up and spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down. "We are having a baby," he repeated, as though saying it aloud made it more real. "Delilah, we are having a baby. This is incredible. You are incredible. I was worried you might not be ready, that it was too soon." "Too soon. We are married, we love each other, we have a stable home and good work. This is perfect timing." He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our child. I cannot believe it." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Delilah bloomed with it. Ann Chandler was a wealth of knowledge and support, having raised 4 children of her own. The other ranch wives rallied around Delilah, providing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and reassurance when she felt overwhelmed by the enormity of becoming a mother. Graham was attentive and protective, insisting she rest whenever she looked tired, bringing her treats from town, talking to her belly each night before they went to sleep. Delilah had written to her mother about the marriage shortly after they arrived in Truckee, and Mary Sullivan had replied with cautious happiness and a promise to visit when she could. When Delilah wrote to tell her about the baby, her mother's next letter arrived full of excitement and plans to come help when the child was born. In late November, with snow falling softly outside, Delilah went into labor. Ann Chandler and a midwife from town attended her, while Graham paced anxiously outside until Ann finally took pity on him and led him into the bedroom to hold his wife's hand. It was a long labor, nearly 12 hours, but finally their son entered the world with a lusty cry that announced his displeasure at the cold air on his skin. "You have a boy," the midwife said, placing the baby on Delilah's chest. "A big, healthy boy." Delilah stared down at her son, overwhelmed by the rush of love she felt for this tiny person. He had Graham's dark hair and her nose, and when he opened his eyes to peer at her, she saw they were a murky blue that might change to any color as he grew. Graham leaned over them both, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "He is perfect. You are perfect. I love you both so much." They named him Daniel Graham Owens, and he quickly became the center of their universe. Graham proved to be a devoted father, taking his turn with nighttime feedings, changing diapers without complaint, singing off-key lullabies that somehow always soothed the baby to sleep. Delilah's mother arrived 2 weeks after the birth and stayed for a month, helping with the household tasks and cooing over her first grandchild. "You chose well," Mary told Delilah one afternoon as they sat together watching Graham play with Daniel. "I had my doubts, I will admit. But that man adores you both. You can see it in everything he does. He is a good man, Mama, the best man I have ever known. I am so grateful that he saw something worth choosing in me when everyone else had decided I was not worth keeping. Those broken engagements were not about your worth, sweetheart. They were about those men's inability to recognize what they had right in front of them. Graham was smart enough to see what they missed. Time moved forward, as it always does. Daniel grew from a baby to a toddler, learning to walk while holding onto the furniture, saying his first words, developing a personality that was equal parts stubborn independence and sweet affection. Graham continued to excel at his work, and Chandler promoted him to ranch foreman, a position that came with a raise in pay and increased responsibility. 2 years after Daniel was born, Delilah found herself pregnant again. This time, she knew what to expect, and the pregnancy felt easier despite the challenges of chasing after an active toddler while growing another child. Their daughter arrived on a bright spring morning, smaller than her brother had been but just as healthy. They named her Sarah Mary Owens, after Graham's mother and Delilah's. With 2 children, the little house felt increasingly cramped, and Chandler offered them a larger house closer to the main buildings. It had 3 bedrooms and more space for their growing family, and they moved gratefully, though Delilah felt a touch of nostalgia for the little house where she and Graham had first learned to love each other. The years spun out in a pattern of seasons and celebrations, challenges and joys. Daniel started school in Truckee, riding into town with Graham each morning. Sarah proved to be a serious, thoughtful child who loved helping her mother in the garden. Delilah's mother visited twice a year, always staying for weeks at a time, spoiling her grandchildren shamelessly. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Graham surprised Delilah with a trip to San Francisco. They left the children with Ann Chandler and spent 3 days in the city, staying in a real hotel, eating in restaurants, seeing sights that Delilah had only read about in books. On their last evening, as they walked along the waterfront watching the sun set over the bay, Graham pulled her close. "You ever think about how we started?" he asked, How completely insane our beginning was. Sometimes, Delilah admitted. It still seems impossible that a marriage that began as a practical arrangement between strangers could turn into this. Third time was forever, just like I promised. You did promise that, did you not? Standing there in the street in Downeyville, barely knowing my name. I knew enough. I knew you had courage. I knew you had been treated unfairly and were not going to let it break you. I knew you were beautiful and spoke your mind. That seemed like enough to build on. Delilah laughed, leaning into his warmth. You are a romantic, Graham Owens, even if you pretend otherwise. Only with you. You make it easy. They returned home to their children and their life on the ranch, settling back into routines that felt as comfortable as worn leather. Graham had become indispensable to the ranch operation, and Chandler had recently made him a partner, giving him a small stake in the business and ensuring his long-term security. Delilah had become known throughout the area for her garden produce and her herbal remedies, which she shared freely with neighbors in need. When Daniel turned 12, Graham began teaching him about horses and ranch work, gradually bringing him into the family business. Sarah, at 10, showed more interest in books and learning, and Delilah arranged for her to receive extra tutoring from the schoolteacher in town. Both children were healthy and happy, secure in the love of their parents and the community that surrounded them. One autumn evening, as Delilah and Graham sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Delilah found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 16 years ago, she had been standing in the street of Downeyville, humiliated and rejected, facing a future that seemed impossibly bleak. Now she had a husband who cherished her, 2 wonderful children, a home she loved, and a community where she was valued and respected. "What are you thinking about?" Graham asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About that day we met. About how close I came to not going to the livery stable, to not taking a chance on your insane proposal. What would you have done instead? I do not know. Gone to my aunt's, I suppose. Or maybe to San Francisco after all. Found some sort of work, made some sort of life. But it would not have been this life. It would not have been us." Graham took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "I thank God every day that you showed up that morning. That you were brave enough to take a leap into the unknown with a stranger who was making ridiculous promises about forever. They were not ridiculous promises. You kept them all. I plan to keep on keeping them. We still have a lot of forever left, Delilah." They sat together as the light faded and the first stars appeared, comfortable in the silence that comes from years of deep knowing. Inside the house, they could hear their children's voices as they finished their evening chores and prepared for bed. The ranch stretched around them, peaceful and prosperous. The mountains stood eternal watch over the valley. Delilah thought about the women of Downeyville who had cast her out, who had decided her broken engagements made her unsuitable for their society. She wondered if they ever thought of her, if they would be surprised to learn how well her life had turned out. Probably not, she decided. They had moved on to other scandals, other subjects for their judgment and whispers. But their rejection, painful as it had been at the time, had pushed her toward something better than she could have imagined. If she had married William Cassidy, she would have been trapped in a loveless match with a weak man dominated by his mother. If she had married Thomas Brennan, she would have spent her life with someone who cared more about others' opinions than his own heart. Instead, she had been given the gift of Graham Owens, a man who had seen her clearly on their very first meeting and had chosen her without hesitation or doubt. "Graham," she said softly, "thank you for third time forever." He turned to kiss her temple, his lips warm against her skin. "Best decision I ever made." The years continued their steady march. Daniel grew into a confident young man, skilled with horses and ready to take on more responsibility on the ranch. He began courting a girl from town, the daughter of the general store owner, and Graham and Delilah watched with amusement as their son experienced the nervous excitement of first love. Sarah finished school at the top of her class and announced her intention to become a teacher, much to Delilah's pride. When Daniel married at 20, Graham gave him a portion of land on the ranch to build his own house, ensuring the next generation would continue the work they had built together. His young wife, Emma, was a sweet-natured girl who fit seamlessly into the family. Within a year, they had made Graham and Delilah grandparents, a role they embraced with joy. Sarah went to Sacramento for teacher training and returned 2 years later with her certificate and a fiancé, a young lawyer she had met through mutual friends. They married in a ceremony at the ranch, with half the county in attendance, and moved to Truckee, where Sarah took a teaching position and her husband opened his practice. Robert Chandler passed away when Graham was 48, leaving his portion of the ranch to his son, but ensuring through his will that Graham's partnership stake remained secure. The transition was smooth, and Graham continued to run the day-to-day operations while Robert's son focused on the business side of the enterprise. Delilah's mother lived to see her 82nd birthday, passing peacefully in her sleep during one of her visits to the ranch. They buried her in the Truckee cemetery, and Delilah grieved deeply, but also with gratitude for the years they had shared and the blessing of her mother's support during the most difficult period of her life. The world changed around them. The frontier era faded into memory as the new century approached. Automobiles began to appear on the roads, though horses remained the primary mode of transportation on the ranch. Telephones connected distant communities. The Wild West of Delilah and Graham's youth became the settled West of their middle age, but through all the changes, their love remained constant. They had built something solid and true from the most unlikely of beginnings, and it had sustained them through everything life brought their way. They had proven that third time really could be forever, that a stranger's promise in a dusty street could become a lifetime of devotion. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a celebration at the ranch. Nearly 100 people attended, testament to the life they had built and the community they had become part of. As Delilah looked around at the gathering, at the faces of people she loved and who loved her in return, she felt a profound sense of peace. Graham found her in the crowd and pulled her aside, leading her away from the party to the quiet of their porch. The setting sun painted everything in golden light, and in that glow, Graham looked hardly different from the young cowboy who had proposed marriage to a stranger 30 years before. "Any regrets?" he asked, the same question they had asked each other so many times over the years. "Not a single one," Delilah replied, also as she always did. "You? Only that I did not meet you sooner, but then again, maybe we both needed to become who we were before we could find each other." "That is a very philosophical observation, Mr. Owens." "I have my moments, Mrs. Owens." They kissed as they had kissed thousands of times before, but it still carried the spark of something special, something worth celebrating. When they returned to the party, hand in hand, their family cheered and Daniel raised his glass in a toast. "To my parents, who taught me that real love is not about grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but about choosing each other every single day. May we all be as lucky as they have been." The gathering echoed the sentiment, and Delilah felt tears prick her eyes. She leaned into Graham's solid presence, grateful beyond words for the life they had created together. The years grew shorter as they aged, as years do. Graham's dark hair turned silver, and Delilah's face gained lines that mapped decades of smiles and laughter. They slowed down but remained active, still taking daily walks around the ranch property, still sitting together on their porch each evening. Their children visited regularly, bringing grandchildren who grew into teenagers and then young adults. Daniel took over more and more of the ranch operations as Graham eased into a well-earned semi-retirement. On a summer morning in their 53rd year of marriage, Delilah woke to find Graham watching her with an expression of such tenderness that her breath caught. The early light streaming through the window turned his silver hair into a halo, and she reached up to touch his face. "Good morning," she said softly. "Good morning, my love. I was just thinking about how beautiful you are." "I am 76 years old, Graham. Beautiful is a generous description. You have always been beautiful to me. You always will be." "That was true the first moment I saw you standing in the street in Downeyville, and it is true now." They rose and went about their morning routine, the comfortable dance of a couple who had spent more than half a century together. After breakfast, they walked to the small cemetery on the ranch property where several generations now rested. They visited the graves of friends and family, pulling a few weeds, straightening flowers, speaking quietly about their memories. "Do you ever wonder what happened to those men who broke off your engagements?" Graham asked as they walked back toward the house. "William Cassidy and Thomas Brennan." "Not really. I heard William died years ago, some illness or another. I do not know about Thomas." "But Graham, they gave me the greatest gift they could have, even though they did not mean to." "What gift was that?" "They set me free. If either of them had kept their promises, I would never have been standing in that street the day you rode into town. I would never have known what real love feels like, so in a way I should be grateful to them for their weakness." Graham pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I am certainly grateful to them. Their loss was my gain, and I never took that for granted. I know you did not." "Not for a single day." They spent the afternoon on their porch, reading and talking and watching the mountains change colors as the sun moved across the sky. Grandchildren stopped by with great-grandchildren, filling the house briefly with noise and energy before departing again. Daniel came to discuss some ranch business, but mostly just to check on his parents and spend time with them. As evening approached and the golden light began to fade toward purple dusk, Delilah and Graham found themselves alone again, sitting close together on the bench they had occupied countless times over the decades. "You remember what you said to me that first day?" Delilah asked. "About third time being forever. I remember every word of that conversation. I was terrified you would think I was insane and walk away. I did think you were insane. I just decided that insane was better than the alternative." She smiled at the memory. "You were right, though. Third time was forever, is forever, and will continue to be forever for as long as we have. I love you, Delilah Owens. I have loved you for 53 years, and I will love you beyond that. I love you too, Graham. Thank you for taking a chance on a cast-out woman with a scandalous history. Thank you for taking a chance on a wandering cowboy with an improbable proposal." They sat together as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. The ranch was quiet around them, peaceful in the gathering night. Their home glowed with lamplight behind them, warm and welcoming. In the distance, they could hear cattle lowing softly and the occasional whinny of a horse. It was an ordinary evening, unremarkable in its details. But it was also extraordinary in its way, because it was one more evening in a lifetime of evenings they had shared. One more chance to sit together and remember how far they had come from that dusty street in Downeyville, where a stranger had offered a desperate woman an impossible promise. The years had proven that impossible promise to be true. Third time had been forever. The cast-out woman with 2 broken engagements had found a love that lasted, a partnership that endured, a life that far exceeded anything she could have imagined in her darkest moment. And the cowboy who had said those words had kept every promise he made, building a forever out of faith and hard work and devotion that never wavered. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, they finally went inside, closing the door on another day of their shared forever. Tomorrow would bring new moments, new memories to add to the vast collection they had built together. But tonight, they simply held each other close and were grateful for every single day that had brought them from that first meeting to this present moment. In the bedroom they had shared for decades, Graham helped Delilah with the buttons on her dress that her arthritic fingers struggled with now. She helped him with his boots, which his stiff back made difficult to remove. They moved with the practiced ease of longtime partners, each anticipating the other's needs without having to ask. When they finally lay down together, Graham pulled Delilah close, her head resting on his shoulder as it had done thousands of times before. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, a rhythm that had become as familiar to her as her own breathing. "What are you thinking about?" Graham asked sleepily. "About how lucky I am, how lucky we are. We could have so easily missed each other, Graham. If Cal Peterson had not been causing trouble that day, if I had not intervened, if you had not been in Downeyville at that exact moment, if I had not been brave enough to meet you at the livery stable. There were so many points where our paths could have diverged, but they did not. Maybe that was fate or God or just blind luck, but we found each other, Delilah, and once we found each other we held on. That is what matters." "Yes," she agreed softly, "we held on. Through everything we held on to each other." They drifted toward sleep, still holding each other, still grateful for one more day of the forever they had promised each other so long ago. Outside, the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The mountains stood watch over the valley. The ranch slept peacefully, generations of hard work and love built into every fence post and building. And in their bed, 2 people who had started as strangers and become everything to each other rested in the peace that comes from a life well lived and a love well kept. They had taken the most improbable of chances and turned it into the most beautiful of realities. They had proven that sometimes the craziest decisions are the ones that make the most sense in the end. Third time had indeed been forever, just as a cowboy had promised a cast-out woman on a dusty street in 1874. And 53 years later, that promise still held true, as strong and certain as the day it had first been spoken. They had built their forever together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of love at a time, and it had been, from beginning to end, absolutely worth it.